Hello everyone, we've still got over 45 minutes of video to get through, and I'm absolutely committed to this being the final part, so we're literally going to jump into it right away. And I think if I remember correctly, last week we finished up with a portion of the video that I was like saying, I might need to respond to this in detail, so let's jump in, shall we?
Either way, it's perfectly consistent to both be in favour of increasing female visibility and participation in things and affirming trans people.
Okay, so basically what I was saying is that the idea of pushing for female representation becomes like incoherent, is what I should say, if you are also saying that anyone who identifies as a woman automatically becomes a woman. And I don't think he didn't really respond to that very well, because obviously, logically, no one can really deny that, right? Because what it could mean is you could literally have 50% of people in Parliament just decide to identify as women, and suddenly we have a completely gender equal Parliament, if you like. But obviously that's not true, right? Like, obviously, you've not actually changed anything if just 50% of people in Parliament decide to identify that way. I think logically no one can disagree with that. I think the only argument you'd have to make is a practical argument. Well, in reality, not many people are going to do that. Okay, but the point is, what we're really arguing about here is principles. And if you are saying in principle that 50% of people in Parliament identifying as women would be the same as good as 50% of people in Parliament actually being women, I think deep down you know that's nonsense. So I'm not saying that you can't care about this issue while affirming trans identity. What I'm saying is that in affirming trans identity, you're admitting that there is an issue that could be solved according to your own logic, while clearly at the same time not actually having the central issue itself be addressed at all. And that is a problem with any kind of position you're going to hold to. He also said that we could include so-called trans women under the category of historical women. No. The problem is when we talk about any sort of gender expression beyond immediately correlating to biological sex, it's immediately going to get incredibly complicated because society has radically changed our views on that. So I don't think you could include them. So you might say that it's not as simple as them just being men, but to say that they're women, I think, is ridiculous. For example, there was a Roman emperor called Elagabalus or something like that. I always get his name wrong because it's some weird combination of words that seems weird to me. But basically, he identified as, well, the thing is that there'll literally be people who say like, oh, this guy might have been a trans woman, but they literally will call him a guy. And the reason they'll call him a guy is because like that just makes sense to them. You know, like that's the thing. I have literally heard people say, oh, this person probably identified as a woman, but they'll be simultaneously calling him he. And these are people who I don't think would actually do this about a contemporary trans person, but I think the reason why they're comfortable doing it here is because they know deep down that this person wasn't a trans woman in the way we think of it in a contemporary sense, and as such, even while they wouldn't nowadays refer to, contrapoints by he, him pronouns, they are perfectly comfortable to do that about some of these historical figures who maybe identify this way. But even still, it's just a very different situation. For example, this Elagabalus guy, he was like a pagan who had all sorts of weird like religious ideas and things like that. And I think there was like a thing where he thought he was a particular kind of god, and I think maybe he thought he was like a goddess. I could be wrong about that. But it's some kind of weird thing going on to do with like religious and metaphysical beliefs, which means we're not really talking about the same concept as being a trans woman. So yeah, I just don't think this idea of, like, historically we can say that it's never just as simple as biological sex. But I think we also have to recognize historically biological sex always matters. Like, it's significant. Even if we do say this guy was actually a trans woman, it's significant that we recognize he was also biologically male, and that complicates things.
There can't be any polysemy in the term woman. It has to be applying with this conceptual analysis in both cases, right? Because words don't change on the basis of the context that they're in or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, basically there he's saying, well, it can change. The problem with that is that's an excuse you can make for any level of hypocrisy, right? Essentially what you're saying there is, well, I want to use the words this way when it's convenient for me, but I don't want to accept the use of the words this way when it's not convenient for me, like when we're saying that Parliament would be completely gender equal if everybody just decided to identify as a woman. You could use that argument at any point and just say, well, it's because, obviously words can mean different things in different contexts. Well, yeah, sure, they can. But obviously taking that logic too far, and you do literally get someone just saying, well, words can mean different things in different contexts, so therefore, here's how I'm going to use the word, and anytime that works for me, that's fine. Anytime it doesn't work for me, I'm just going to reject it, which, of course, is a very kind of intellectually dishonest way of arguing.
Video, like, share, subscribe.
Okay. So he literally clicked to the end.
I just introduced that kind of change where I'm going to make videos illegal to lifestyle. It's kind of already said.
Weirdly, he skipped to the end and he's literally just skipped to the bit where I'm like saying kind of unimportant.
I was surprised at how much engagement there was in the comments. 102 comments.
That's just how you guys are. Okay, this is interesting. So he skipped to the end of the video and we've still got 40 minutes left. Is this literally just going to be him? Okay, like whatever. We'll see what happens. I'm not. I'm a bit concerned. I'm a bit concerned about what's going to be happening now.
And I guess I was just kind of surprised that this demographic exists.
See, that's something that when you're saying that's got to give you a sense of, like a sense of pausing and being like, well, why were you surprised at that? Because I've said before, and I think this is a really important reality, that when I first heard about gender critical feminism, I assumed it was a joke. I think a lot of people, they have this idea in their head that being progressive is just it's a package deal. So if you're going to be progressive, by the way, my tummy just rumbled. I hope that you couldn't hear it at all, but if you could hear it, I want it on the record. It was just a tummy rumble, nothing more sinister than that. Anyway, a package deal where if you're going to be progressive, you have to also affirm trans identity. And therefore people think, well, obviously I have to affirm trans identity. And they think, well, anyone who's different from this, they must actually be conservative deep down. And that's why you have this big effort to characterize J.K. Rowling as conservative. And don't get me wrong, J.K. Rowling is a liberal, which I think liberal implies some conservative sympathies, but she's not a conservative. I think it's very unreasonable to call J.K. Rowling a conservative. Even Graham Linehan I wouldn't call a conservative. But like that's the thing, they need to do that because to acknowledge that there are left-wing gender-critical people is very difficult. And to be honest, like I'm going to say this on the record now, it's a slightly a conspiratorial thing, but it is interesting to me. And the causality here could be all manner of different ways, but it's interesting to me that a lot of prominent gender-critical people are clearly more conservative. Because if I were to talk about kind of the three most prominent gender-critical people, or maybe let's say even the four, but I'll start with three. It could be like J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, and Kelly J. Keane. And all three of those people are certainly to the right of me. They're to the right of someone like Rubble of Empires. I think they're even to the right of someone, I say even, I was going to say to the right of someone like Peak Trans. I'm not suggesting Peak Trans is by any means like conservative, so I'm not like even to the right of arch conservative Peak Trans, but I'm just saying like Peak Trans I think is more of the, like I don't think Peak Trans is like a hardcore Marxist, for example. It's so convenient for the trans activist movement, and I'm not begrudging the aforementioned individuals having their own platform where they, basically are quite involved in representing this movement. I'm not begrudging that at all. But I will say it's quite convenient for the trans activist movement that these are the people, because, again, regardless of how you feel about them, and this, you could say applies a lot to Kelly J, but it also applies to Graham Linehan, Kelly J. King, Graham Linehan. I think J.K. Rowling's a little bit like this is less true of her, but if someone finds out about the gender critical movement and they're coming from a progressive perspective and they're like, and they hear about it as, oh, you can be a progressive and you can be opposed to trans identity. And then they say, well, let me see what the biggest gender critical kind of influencers, channels, thinkers are. And they see that Graham Linehan has a whole load of subscribers with The Mess We're In, that podcast. Kelly J. Keane obviously has a lot of subscribers. And then they go onto Twitter and they see plenty of, Kelly J. Keane recently did a Twitter space or whatever, and I guess probably a video as well that I saw called socialist women hate other women or something like that. Well, that's a very, that's explicitly drawing a line in the sand and saying that, casting yourself directly in opposition to the left wing. So you couldn't blame someone for thinking, oh, I'm a progressive and the gender critical movement is apparently basically a way to oppose trans identity without the standard conservative objection of just wanting to actually uphold gender roles. And then they're like, oh, let me look into some more detail. And one of the first most prominent people they see is somebody who's literally talking about how much they hate socialists and cast themselves in opposition to socialists. And, Kelly J. Keane, she tweets stuff about Muslims, which again, I do not have a problem with criticizing Islam, but I just think it's one of those situations where, obviously people, that's another big cultural issue. And it's very much a kind of one where right now it's associated with the right. So all that is to say, I don't actually think that the trans lobby is secretly funding specific individuals who make the gender critical movement seem more right-wing than it is, and are specifically suppressing individuals who make the gender critical movement seem more progressive than it is. But I'm instead, I think, suggesting that it just has happened to work out for them rather conveniently that that's the case. That a few years ago, it would have been much easier to argue the gender critical movement was progressive. When I got involved in the gender critical movement, most of the voices I was hearing were very obviously and readily identifiably progressive. And I don't think that's really true anymore, which I think is obviously difficult because the thing we want to do is win over progressives, right? Because if this just becomes a conservative culture war issue where it's oh, well, you're against trans identity if you're conservative, well, then it's going to flip-flop with every single election. We're only going to win this situation once and for all when everybody recognizes that this isn't a political issue. This is about reality. So that was just a bit of a rant. But with that said, considering that in reality, there are plenty of progressive gender-critical individuals, it would be nice for this guy to maybe be well, hold on a minute. Clearly, this person, me, is progressive, and clearly I advocate this gender critical point of view, and clearly I do have a significant fan base, for him to realize, hey, maybe that means he's wrong in his assumption that all these people must just be conservative and bigots, basically.
Because it's not the same demographic that's just kind of hero worship bigotry, on Peter's channel. Yeah.
See, again, that's the thing. You'd think he'd have to realize that, right? It's not the same demographic that hero worships bigotry. It's just weird because if you don't remember, in the earlier parts that I've done, he literally said that he doesn't think actually that this is about caring about reality. He thinks all the biological reality talk, the words need to have definitions talk, all of that stuff, he said he thought was just smoke and mirrors intended to obfuscate the fact that really this is just about a base bigotry. The fact that he's now it's almost, I feel kind of secondhand embarrassed because now he's going oh, but what's weird is that this doesn't cohere with when I look at the comments and the attitudes of the people involved in this, that doesn't cohere with that at all. And it's well, maybe that should be an indication that you're a bit wrong.
There's one group that assumes there's something they aren't. Therefore, they requiring changing how everyone understands language. Nice. You're talking about the faggots, right? And the Jews.
Okay, that doesn't work as a... it's kind of funny, right? That he literally went from being you'd think he had a moment of clarity where he's like, I mean, I hope this guy's actually gay. I mean, he could be. But yeah, going from being like, oh, this is weird, because this guy, you know, he doesn't actually have a demographic that seems particularly bigoted, or an audience that seems particularly bigoted. And then he gets a comment that's just like, hey, you know, these people are insisting there's something they aren't. And then he immediately attributes to them an incredibly, like, bigoted attitude of, you know, calling people slurs. But of course, the weird thing about that is that the criticism of gay people and Jews is not that they insist there's something they're not. Like, that's not the main criticism that's leveled at them. Unless you were going to phrase it in completely moralistic terms of like, well, they insist they're not evil, but really they are. But obviously that's not comparable to trans identity, where the concern is very much just, well, they're making a claim about fundamentally what they are, that they are women instead of men, and they're wrong about that. So yeah. God, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, we've still got over 40 minutes left, and he's just like looking at his screen and clicking, and it's like, but he's going to get comments, and maybe those comments are going to be interesting, but at the same time, I don't want to sit here for 40 minutes to just wait for him to find comments he likes. So pardon me while I speed up. Like, this is a problem, right? Because if I'm going to say that I'm going to tackle this video in 3 parts, and he spends only 2/3 of the video talking about me, then I'm stuck here for the final third. But I will say this is an interesting idea. He actually just posts the StreamYard invite to the chat, so anyone could just enter, and like, you know, he can like have them come in. That actually seems kind of fun. It never even occurred to me as an option to just like have people like come on talk for just like a few minutes.
I doubt that society is going to find a good way to accommodate people's needs to have simplifying assumptions around concepts of gender and sex. I think this is right. I think that this is right generally.
Okay, so this comment is from someone, and you just heard it. And I assume it's kind of calling out me and saying like, oh, you know, people won't be able to accommodate my point of view or something like that. But they really can, because again, all my simplifying assumption is that, well, like, that's the thing, because again, assuming, because obviously I agree, like, if people have simplified assumptions about gender and sex, then that is going to be difficult to accommodate, because in reality people are very diverse. But simply saying that biological males are all men, it's not really an imposition. It doesn't come into conflict with the diversity of human beings at all. In fact, I think it kind of helps to better explain the diversity of human beings, because when you have diversity, you need something to anchor that diversity around and say, well, sure, everyone's very diverse, but it all comes back to this thing. So saying that all biological males are men then allows us, I think, to talk about the diversity of men in a much more helpful way, rather than claiming that some of the diversity of gender actually causes biological males to not even be men anymore, which I think is actually less helpful.
Whereby they agree that the definition of woman is adult human female. I don't think that that's actually a problem, because I just think it's not true. I think that people use the words and they don't have a particular definition in mind.
Just for the record, I've said this before, if people are using words, they necessarily have a definition. Just because you don't know what the definition is doesn't mean you don't, like, as soon as you use a word, you have created a definition, because the definition is simply an explanation of what you're saying. If I'm constantly using, I don't know, the word country to describe certain places but not other places, I can't then claim I don't have a definition of country. I must have a definition of country. Because the fact that I'm calling some things country and not other things means that I think the word has a meaning, and I'm using that word in a way that's consistent with a given meaning. So that meaning exists, and whatever that meaning, whatever the way I'm using the word is, that's how I'm defining the word.
A naive type of scientific realism that I had as well, where I thought that scientists were really like picking out the way that reality is carved at the joints or something, and thinking about
when this guy's saying, you know, oh, the reason why I used to be against trans identity is because I had this like simplistic view of science, and I thought that like science could solve all our problems. Well, that's not my point of view. I mean, I really do approach this issue from much more of a philosophical perspective. So yeah, like, it just doesn't apply to me. So I think I'm gonna, I guess I'm just gonna ignore it. Whatever. Why do I care what this guy's saying? What am I doing, right? So I'm just like thinking to myself, how long have we been recording for? Half an hour. Usually I record for an hour and like 10-20 minutes. So here's the situation. Either we respond to the next most popular video, which is J.K. Rowling refutes her own arguments. Or I see whether this specific person has anything else that I'd be interested in responding to, but, like, I don't really care. He has some, some stuff around atheism.
We started off discussing the idea of adoptive parents and why they are just as valid, as normal parents, which we agreed on. The only condition there being is I was kind of arguing for the case that an adoptive parent at least has necessary conditions that we can all agree on as a society that are necessary for them to be an adoptive parent, i.e. them adopting the child and looking after that child. That's a necessary condition, surely, to be a...
Alright, look, I watched one thing, and it's basically so pretty much what's going on here. The thing is, the reason why I'm not that interested in this is because I feel like obviously it's very unlikely that there's going to be any arguments here that I've not heard of before, so it's not like I'm like, oh, let me find a wonderful argument in this content that's really worth responding to. But yeah, here, just for the record, my stance on the adoptive parents thing has always been, well, the difference is that being a parent is a role you can do, it's a job you can do, and therefore, I think it's reasonable to say that somebody, it goes beyond the biological, because somebody can be fulfilling that role without being biologically a parent. However, you can't say that about woman, because then you're arguing that being a woman is a role you can do. If you're going to say, well, somebody can be a parent despite not biologically being a parent because they're assuming the role of taking care of children, and then you're going to liken that to being a woman, you're really only a stone's throw away from literally saying, well, somebody can be a woman if they perform the role of taking care of children because that's a woman's role. Now, I know they would say, well, not necessarily it's about taking care of children, but the thing is you are likening it to the role of taking care of children by choosing parent as your specific example. So I do think this whole adoptive parent versus biological parent thing is not a good argument. But yeah, I think I'm just gonna have to move on to the next video. I think that's literally what I'm gonna have to do. I've got really three options, or so essentially the options were: one, try to find something from this Digital Gnosis channel that is worth responding to. It's I just can't be bothered. I don't think it's a particularly fun. I know I make this content myself sometimes, or I used to make this content, but I think the live stream format is an incredibly annoying format to respond to. It's a fine format to watch, don't get me wrong, I would be perfectly fine. I listen to live streams all the time. There are plenty of live streams I listen to, but to respond to a live stream is very tedious. I'm almost inclined to be hey, going forward, guys, I'm not going to be responding to live streams anymore, because it's incredibly annoying, because obviously, necessarily, there are strengths that a live stream has. Definitely. It's more personable. It's more kind of potentially fun in that you have the sense of someone thinking on their feet. It perhaps feels a little less manufactured or kind of artificial, because obviously there is a necessary artificiality that comes about from the scripting process. I think definitely this video here, or these types of videos where I'm just talking completely off the cuff, are different from the videos on my main channel where I script it. So there are differences, but those differences have different strengths and different weaknesses. So I kind of went through some of the strengths, but the weakness, of course, is that you're not going to be making your points as efficiently as possible. You're not necessarily going to be organizing your points in the best way, because you're just going to be saying the points as they come into your brain. Because I edit and script, or especially I script and plan out my videos on my main channel, I know the difference between scripted content and unscripted content, in the way that when I am first coming up with a plan for a scripted video, the first thing I'll do is just list out all the thoughts I have. Just think to myself, well, what do I want to say about this issue? And then I will move those points around a lot in order to make sure that one point more efficiently flows into the next. So that right there speaks to the fact that that's obviously something that I'm not doing if I'm just listing off. The fact it changes so much the way I kind of organize and structure the points between when I'm just listing it off as the thoughts come to me, compared to scripting it out and like planning it out so that it specifically goes in an order which I think is best for the points to go in, speaks to how different it is. So I don't really want to respond to any more of this guy's content. So then it's like, well, what else do? I could do what I sometimes do, which is respond to the most recent, the next most popular video. The problem is that means that then I kind of, I'll be asking you guys the same question this coming week about, do you want me to just continue with this video or move? And it's like, I kind of enjoy having the 4-option video poll. So I'm kind of like, I should, have that instead, because, again, J.K. Rowling refutes her own anti-trans arguments. Like, it's 60 minutes long. I'd have to rush through it, considering I've only got, like a little under 40 minutes left. I'd have to rush through it. And I wouldn't have as much fun with it, and I'd be aware of it that it's kind of an afterthought. And again, only 31% of people voted for me to respond to it. But again, it's just the fact I don't want to do that. I don't want to be coming back like next week and being like, this coming week and just being like, hey guys, do you want me to continue to respond to this video again? Essentially, what happened is I was clicking around, and obviously this guy, the original context here was me responding to a video by Rationality Rules, and now I'm looking. And I found a Rationality Rules video. It's called "The Bible is Evil, Why Apologists Ignore These Verses," and I'm like really interested. This is such a waste of time.
If they refused, they fell to the sword. This barbarism has always been recognised for what it is, evil. But what if I told you that
Okay, look, I don't care, but already like the first premise is just not like, it's not hitting me. Like, no, I don't really look at the Mongol conquest as evil. I look at it as just a natural part of like human civilization. Like human civilizations have always warred against each other. Yeah, but that's the thing. I don't know, like the whole, I think I'm not actually going to continue doing this because I don't really care, but I will say this, like the whole like moral critique of the Bible, it always just comes across to me as incredibly naive. Because from my perspective, I'm just like, well, that's how society was. I think if you were going to make an argument that, because for example, if you take something like human sacrifice in the Aztec religion, well, that was something that was like not an ordinary part of a given society, right? Like cutting, like holding people down and cutting them open and taking out their heart while they're still alive. That's like a weirdly, uniquely evil thing to do. Or like in Hindu religion, where it's like basically after a woman's husband had died, they would burn the woman alive on the husband's funeral pyre. That was called like widow burning. Again, that's like a uniquely evil thing. I feel like if you're going to make an argument against Christianity or like, the Bible, you'd have to point to some kind of uniquely evil thing, not just be like, well, they also did conquest. Okay, I'm actually going to respond to the J.K. Rowling video. I don't care. Like, I mean, I'm sure actually, like, I wouldn't be surprised if some of you would be interested in me responding to this video by Rationality Rules. The Bible is evil. Why apologists ignore these verses? But honestly, I feel like I should actually, like, I'm kind of looking at like, well, to be fair, only 38% of people voted for me to respond to like the video I responded to, 31%. So it's only a 7% point difference. We're going to start this video. I'm being a hypocrite. This has been a disaster. You're welcome to end your Patreon contribution because this is just completely falling apart. No, I'm joking. Please stick around. Anyway, let's jump in.
Bigotry is inherently irrational. That's to say that there's no sound basis to hate a demographic, whether it be a certain ethnicity,
Good thing no one hates trans people. Well, some people hate trans people, but there's nothing about being gender critical that means hating a trans person.
religion, gender, or sexuality. It's therefore unsurprising when members of hate movements, such as gender critical fascism,
Gender critical fascism, wow.
catch them
That doesn't even make any sense because like fascism is all about like maintaining traditional order and roles, and yet being gender critical is literally being critical of a traditional order and role.
And today we're here to talk about how, in an attempt to silence the parent of a child with a trans friend, J.K. Rowling managed to refute her own position.
Okay, I actually don't know about this story, so I'm interested, but I'm also wondering how it could possibly, like, how even doing that could refute the position of it doesn't make sense to say biological males are women.
My son has gone to have a week at his trans friend's house. Guess what? I'm not worried about that, but I am worried he'll get his head kicked in by a man high on his #toxic masculinity and emboldened by the othering you perpetuate. Hashtag make violence is the issue.
Make violence. What is hashtag make violence? What is make violence? Is that not supposed to, I'm like thinking to myself, were they not supposed to be like saying hashtag male violence is the issue? In which case, if they're saying male violence is like, I don't know, because maybe make violence is the thing, but I would think hashtag male violence is the issue. But then like, if you think male violence is the issue, then surely you'd have a problem with males identifying as women, so that makes no sense. Also, again, my son has gone to have a week at his trans friend's house. Notice this, okay? Generally speaking, the concern around, like the safety concern around trans identity is not about males being the victims, right? In fact, I don't know, I was going to say like, if based on the fact that this is clearly coming from a transaffirming perspective, and usually boys tend to be friends with other boys, or maybe in this case, I don't know how old the son is, maybe he's a man. I would think maybe this is talking about potentially a so-called trans man, in which case this is a biological female and a biological male, in which case there'll be even less reason to be concerned about the son. But yeah, saying you're not concerned about your son, yeah, of course, because there's no real situation where a trans, there's not really any situation where a trans-identified individual could present a threat to a male. Now, obviously, you could say, well, in the same sense that any given male could present a threat to a male. But if we're talking about in general, obviously, there's no reason why a trans person needs to be like this. But you'd either be talking about, again, like I said, a trans-identified female, in which case, absolutely, a female is unlikely to be any sort of threat to a male, or a trans-identified male who is typically likely to be more effeminate if they've had any sort of, again, I don't know how old the son's supposed to be. It could be that this is like a sort of university, because it's saying his trans friend's house. Like, this could be a case of like more young adult people who are, hanging out with each other, because that is the thing that happens, of course. I had some friends who stayed around my house relatively recently, because I've got university friends. Obviously they live all over the country. So if we're ever going to get together, especially to do something like go out at night, it makes sense that, they come and crash around my house. So yeah, I've had, as an adult, male friends stay around my house. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, because obviously all I'm getting here is that this could be potentially an adult male we're talking about here, in which case an adult male, absolutely no threat. Obviously, young boys don't have the same benefits of what's it called? Puberty. But I don't know. Essentially, the point I'm making here is a pretty obvious point. There's no real situation where we'd be talking about a son being under any sort of threat. Or at least, certainly, if they're under any sort of threat, it's going to be no worse than the threat that a woman's going to, or a girl, a daughter, is going to be facing. But yeah, I'm not worried about that. But I am worried he'll get his head kicked in by a man, high on his toxic masculinity, and emboldened by the othering you perpetuate. Now, like, I don't really get what this is saying, right? Because it's like, okay, one, why are you worried that your son is going to get his head kicked in by a man? What is your son doing? What is your son doing that means, like, and I'm not saying like, oh, there's no possible, like, your son must be like bringing it on or something. I'm just saying like that's not a normal concern just to have whenever you're sending. Like, I can understand if you've got a daughter, you might think any time you send her out anywhere, you'd be worried because instances of violence against women are so high. But saying, oh, I've got a son and I'm just sending him somewhere and I'm worried he's going to get his head kicked in, it doesn't really make any sense. Then high on his hashtag toxic masculinity. Okay. I like, obviously toxic masculinity is a problem. But it's a problem that, like, when you look at the way that a lot of so-called, like, there's a lot of people who claim to be women who are in fact men, and they have a very toxically masculine attitude towards J.K. Rowling that you can see in our comments, and emboldened by the othering you perpetuate. Now, here's what I don't understand. Why would her son be emboldened, or why would her son's attacker be emboldened by the othering that J.K. Rowling's perpetuating? Unless her son is also trans-identified, which is to say, I guess, therefore, a biological female, in fact. In which case, I guess that on the one hand makes the comment about, like, potentially being worried make more sense, because if your son is in fact a biological female, then well, biological females are the ones, like I already said, violence against women and girls is actually a problem. So that makes more sense. But then it's like at the same time, well, obviously you're not worried about like the trans friend. Like you're talking about a trans person. Like that would make no sense. It's like if you had like a black friend or a black kid or whatever. Again, it would be a bit weird because you would presumably not have a black kid unless you yourself are black, but whatever. You have like a black friend. So we'll say, just keep it simple. And you're like, hey, I sent my black friend to go hang out with a black person and I wasn't worried that they'd be attacked by the black person. It's like, well, obviously not. Like, because if you've got it just doesn't really make any sense to be like, I have a trans kid and I sent him to go hang out with another trans kid, and I wasn't worried about the fact the other kid was trans. Well, like, obviously not, because you're clearly okay with having a trans kid if you've got a trans... It doesn't really make any sense. But then it's like, at the same time, if instead your kid is cis and not trans, then why would they be attacked due to J.K. Rowling's comments? And then, of course, yeah, as I already said, we've got the hashtag make violence is the issue, which must be talking about male violence, but that doesn't make any sense because if you recognize male violence is the issue, how could you possibly be criticizing J.K. Rowling? I'm glad I'm responding to this. I mean, honestly, responding to the Rationality Rules video about religion would have been fine, but it's not what I do on this channel, so don't worry about it. I spent so long umming and ahhing, and now I'm like, yeah, this is a fun video to be responding to, and I should have just pulled the plug earlier, so... bully me in the comments about the fact that I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to respond to this video. It's like, no, I should have responded to it. Like 31% of you voted for me to respond to it. So I should have just done it. Anyway, but yeah, and then of course, on top of all of this, you have the fact that, again, this idea that the comments you make cause violence is complete nonsense. J.K. Rowling has not caused any violence. Criticizing an idea is not... Like, again, just to record, like, I don't care. Like, for example, I do criticize Islam. Not a massive amount. Again, for a variety of reasons. It's not my biggest issue right now, but I'll give it as an example, right? I criticize Islam. I have legitimate, I think, criticisms of that religion. If somebody then attacks somebody based on that, I don't really care because it's a truth claim, right? We're talking about truth. Essentially, it's the appeal to consequence fallacy, right? No matter what results from a particular claim, that doesn't affect whether or not that claim is true. So if your primary concern is truth, the only appropriate response when someone's like, oh, what you're saying could cause violence, it has to be just, I don't care, right? Okay, it causes violence. Well, it's still true. Like I didn't go into this because I was thinking it would not cause violence. I went into this because I wanted to express the truth, and I'm not going to stop wanting to do that. Like that was my goal from the beginning. So this whole argument is just complete nonsense. And then of course you have J.K. Rowling's response, breaking women to blame for male violence that hasn't occurred. More news as we get it. Very funny response. Great way to dunk on her or dunk on the person who's making this claim. I kind of assume it's a woman, just because they said hashtag. Again, I think male violence, unless, like, I'm going to be really embarrassed if it turns out hashtag make violence is the thing here, but I think they meant male violence because the K and the L are right next to each other. But yeah, good response from J.K. Rowling. Let's see how this actually is J.K. Rowling dunking on herself.
Breaking. Woman to blame for male violence that hasn't occurred. More news as we get it. End quote.
I'm going to guess, so this is my prediction right out the gate. I think at least one argument, and possibly the only argument, is going to be, well, trans violence doesn't occur that often, and therefore, because it doesn't occur that often compared to the number of interactions between trans-identified males and women, therefore, it's kind of speculative, right? And actually, gender-critical people are mostly worried about male violence that hasn't occurred, or rather, well, trans violence that hasn't occurred, let's say. But of course that's ridiculous because in this context, this person's entirely speculating about, they're speculating about a specific act of violence, whereas the gender critical concern is more about minimizing risk of violence generally. That's point one. But also, of course, the fact that even if there was no risk of violence that the gender critical movement was able to kind of respond to, well, still, what the gender critical movement is ultimately about is the question of can a biological male be a woman? So either way, this is a pretty cut and dry issue. But yeah, we'll see if, maybe that won't even be the argument, but if that is the argument, I want it on the record, I've already refuted it.
Now, there's a lot to say about this, starting with the way in which Rowling attempts to sidestep the established facts that the way minority groups are talked about and presented in public.
Look, okay, it doesn't matter. Like, it's 100% should be sidestepped because it's irrelevant, right? Ultimately, what we should say is the truth. That's it. I think this entire idea of, I don't know, like, I don't really know what the rules are about Patreon and words I can use, because I wouldn't usually use this word on YouTube because I feel like it get me in trouble. I'm going to say it here. Stochastic terrorism. This idea that you can, like, cause terrorism by talking about something in a particular way. I just think it's nonsense, right? Because it literally does not matter what the consequence of what you're saying is if what you're saying is true. Like, in some sense, you know, I feel like you can be really absolute about this. If someone says, like, I've got my finger on the nuclear button, I'm gonna nuke London or New York City or Paris or Tokyo, unless you admit that 2 + 2 = 5. In some sense, I feel like you could say it's still your right to say no. 2 + 2 is equal to 4, and like you can tell me that the consequence of me saying that will be bad, but that doesn't change the reality of the situation. Like, that's genuinely my attitude. I really feel like this idea that the consequences of saying something could possibly bear on whether or not we should say that thing if what we're saying is ultimately an expression of a true belief. I think that's ridiculous. So again, completely legitimate for J.K. Rowling to sideline this issue. I absolutely would sideline it. In fact, I did. Of course, famously in my debate with Vorsh, he was asking me repeatedly about, what are you going to do about the impact of these ideas and the morality and the fact that, like, people are harming themselves and stuff like that. And it's like, I really do not care, Vorsh.
Feminists, which Rowling claims to be, have been openly talking about this key issue for decades. Though, focusing on cis women in particular, namely the idea...
Again, I'll say this here, right? So even if you want to talk about, like, a woman's issue, well, if you're saying something that's actively abusive and, like, you know, kind of hateful about women, well, the problem there is what you're saying in itself. And whether it causes physical harm, it's kind of... there's a really good video about this by Big Joel, the YouTuber Big Joel. And I'm going to have to explain it here because I think it's a great way of getting across this issue. He says, imagine there was a Nazi film made called Lübenschlüben. And this Nazi film, I'll set up the context. He's basically responding to Sargon of Akkad, who's arguing that hate speech can only be harmful if it causes real-world violence. And Joel's giving this example of Lübenschlüben, and he's saying this Lübenschlüben movie advocates for the most extreme violent Nazism. Just the most insane, just kill every non-Aryan whatever, Adolf Hitler ideology. And then he says, now, because this movie is so virulently and unapologetically fascistic and Nazi-ish in its ideology, nobody, because we nowadays live in a society that has overwhelmingly rejected Nazism, nobody actually takes it seriously. Nobody is ever convinced by it to become a Nazi, and nobody is convinced by it to engage in acts of violence. Does it therefore follow that there is nothing wrong with this piece of media? To which the obvious answer is, well, no, of course there's something wrong with this piece of media. It's literally advocating Nazism. And essentially the point that Joel is making is to relate the harm of a piece of media to the real-world actions it causes results in the counterintuitive, and it's counterintuitive because it's wrong, the counterintuitive conclusion that the more hateful something is, thus the less likely it is to convince people, the better it is, because it's less likely to convince people and therefore less likely to result in real-world violence. Like, what you're basically saying is that, you know, a kind of tame, conservative, like, movie that maybe has some negative opinions about a certain group of people, that might actually convince people to have negative points of view, but doesn't explicitly advocate for violence. Because that could cause violence, because it might reach more people and change more people's minds, you're saying that's more harmful than a piece of media that specifically calls for violence, because that's less likely to change people's minds. And that's stupid. But I would take that further and say it works the other way as well, because what he's saying there is, well, a piece of media doesn't need to cause violence in order to be harmful and be worthy of critique. I would say I would go further and basically say that whether or not a piece of media causes violence and causes harm is irrelevant, right? Like, if somebody says, I hate women, and they just list off this massive load of reasons why they hate women, that is as hateful as it is. It is as evil as it is, and it becomes no more evil, no more hateful, if somebody, in response to that piece of media, goes out and commits a violent act against a woman. Just as it would become no less hateful and no less evil if nobody committed that act. Because otherwise, like, the problem is then what you're saying basically is that your assessment of the morality of what an individual is saying doesn't lie with what the individual is saying, but with the hypothetical response of somebody to that statement. So that's why this entire idea of what we're really assessing here is the impact of these words. It's just nonsense. It just doesn't get off the ground for me at all. And I have no interest in it. Like, if you're going to have a problem with something I'm saying, criticize what I'm saying, right? Because the idea that there might be a video that I made years ago that nobody has a problem with, basically, or no reasonable person has a problem with, and then suddenly tomorrow some crazy person decides that that video that I made years ago is going to motivate them to go and commit some horrendous act of violence against a trans person. Does my video therefore suddenly become hateful? Does my video suddenly become any more hateful than it, like because of the actions of some random person? No, it doesn't. So this entire idea in terms of assessing the morality of somebody saying something and the fundamental moral character of what somebody has said, that at all hinges on the reactions of other people, is nonsense. Absolutely.
But by the white men of the community who were invoked by said white women to enact violence on their behalf. Lynchings...
Okay, look. So I will pause there. He made an analogy to lynchings, as you just kind of heard there. The difference there, so I will say this. The one time where I think we can actually talk, or we can directly relate speech to an action, is if the speech is directly calling for that action. So obviously, yes, a woman, well, again, it could be anyone, but I will say, just because it was the example given, a woman accusing a man of sexual assault, if like that becomes, I think, worse if that then results in that man being lynched. Obviously, the same way if a man accuses a woman of, let's say, having an affair in a very kind of honor-based society, and then that results in the woman being killed, like essentially, I guess the logic there would be that if you are perjuring. I'm trying to think of like what. Maybe I'll just use the word false accusation. I feel like there's another word for it, but if you are falsely accusing somebody and then a direct result of that false accusation is violence, perhaps violence that you are explicitly calling for, so you're literally saying, I think someone should do this thing, obviously that changes things in terms of like your moral culpability. But this is not comparable. Like, J.K. Rowling is not actively calling for this violence. So it's just to compare J.K. Rowling saying, I have some broad criticisms of the impact of gender critical ideology on women's rights, to compare that to women specifically falsely accusing men of sexual assault, knowing and perhaps even directly calling for that to lead to these men being lynched, is obviously not comparable. Completely ridiculous.
Buddy up to and promote well-known bigots with a history of accusing a Jewish cabal of transing young girls as a means to sterilize them and...
Okay, so look, I'll just say here, for example, literally, again, the problem becomes here, okay, what if it does turn out that there are a whole load of Jewish people, and, the fact they're Jewish, that doesn't have to be relevant. Like, it's just the fact they are. Like, there's just no way around the fact they are. So let's say there is a group of Jewish people who are pushing this trans agenda. Are you saying that we shouldn't be allowed to say that if it could have negative consequences? Because I think that's nonsense. I think it's nonsense. Like, again, I mean, with the recent riots around immigration, obviously I criticized the riots, but I also said that the idea, because some people were saying, well, anyone who's ever had a criticism of immigration is responsible for these riots. That's nonsense. I've absolutely, I tweeted at the time saying that was nonsense, because it is. But the thing is, I get this idea that we shouldn't be allowed to say correct things because they're hateful is ridiculous. And yeah, if there's a situation where, and to be honest, it's probably true, right? I would imagine that a preponderance, a disproportionate number of the people pushing this trans ideology thing are Jewish. Because Jewish people, for a variety of reasons, tend to be overrepresented in things like academia. They tend to be overrepresented in politics. I think that's fair to say. Certainly in American politics, and trans identity is where, or rather, American politics is where a lot of this trans identity stuff is really kind of powering forth. So with that said, I'll say that now. There's a disproportionate number of Jewish people responsible for this, but the only reason I'm saying that is because the facts force me to say that. To say, well, what if that causes somebody to, engage in an anti-Semitic attack? I don't care. Because, what do you mean? I'm saying a literal true fact. It's literally equivalent to if I say 2 + 2 = 4, and you tell me what if that causes someone to engage in an act of violence. I kind of, I care about it from the perspective I think it's an immoral thing for them to do, but I don't care about it from the perspective of, I guess I need to think twice before I say 2 + 2 = 4. That's a ridiculous thing to say. No, and that's the attitude you should have. If you're going to say something because it's true, then the idea that could cause an act of violence should just be something you are not even fazed by at all, because you need to be really committed to just speaking the truth at all times. Right. So we did something. So I think what I will do actually next week, because we'll basically probably finish this next week and still have some time to go. So what I'll probably do is say that I'll finish this up next week and also have a vote on what you want me to respond to after that. So I hope that you had fun. I don't know how this is going to work out because I'm aware that I spent a significant amount of time in the middle being like, what am I even going to do here? I feel like this will be a little bit shorter when I edit it down. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all. Oh, and forgive me, because this will probably be quite long when it's quite short when I've edited it down, I'll probably leave in more rambles than I usually would. I always try to aim to get it around 50 minutes in length. Which means a lot of the time cutting out some of my rambles, but in this case I probably won't do that. Anyway, I'll see you all next week, and yeah, make sure to think about what videos you'd like me to respond to next week, because like I say, I will definitely finish this up next week and start a new video then. Alright, bye!